Welcome everyone to this second session or part two of our seminars around implementing passwordless. Last week we spoke about implementing passwordless, this sort of the simple and easy way to implement passwordless in an environment where you just have your computers do what we call Entra join. So your PCs connect to Entra, and we also explained how you implement passwordless for your applications, etc. as well. So today we're going to talk about a very common but significantly more complex scenario where we're talking about how to do Windows Hello for Business onto your Windows machine while they sign into both Entra and to on-prem Active Directory. And we call that a hybrid environment and hybrid join. So what I want to talk about today specifically is I want to talk about what it looks like and how you implement this. There's three main options that are available to you and how you implement that. And then we really want to go into the details how you actually enable this. And then we have a nice demo as well where we can show to you what this looks like in an actual environment, because it's always better to see it rather than purely look at slides, of course. So the first thing I really want to talk about is what we mean by hybrid joined. And we spoke about that a little bit last week as well, but obviously it needs to get a little bit more context now. So before we were talking about a device being Entra ID joined, basically that means in that context, when a user is trying to log into their computer, it just authenticates against Entra ID. Now, when we talk about hybrid join, effectively the computer has two domain memberships, one with Entra ID and one with Active Directory. And in that scenario, when you log into a computer, you'll actually be logging into both systems. So there's two authentication challenges that are being fulfilled. Now, here, purely if you just join a computer to Entra ID and you join that same computer to Active Directory, you'll still be logging in with a username and password. So this does not automatically enable passwordless, but you are signing into two systems and you get all the single sign-on working. So a couple of things when you look at this fairly simplified graphic, a couple of things that you need to be aware of that are very important. One is the Entra ID tenant, as you see it here, and your Active Directory domain, they need to be synchronized with each other. And they need to be, or they're recommended, you have a level of flexibility there, but in general, same forest, same domain is always recommended. Is you want to have your Windows computers joined to the same domain where the users sit, and that has to be the same Entra ID tenant. So you can't have your computer sit on one Active Directory domain that is not joined and not synchronized with the same Entra ID tenant. So that whole relationship is important, because ultimately when you sign in, you're signing into two different domains at the same time, and you'll be using the same username and password. So that stuff needs to be the same across the board. Now, another thing which is important, obviously for your Windows machine to sign into Entra ID, obviously you need to have internet connectivity. At the same time, in order to sign into Active Directory for that authentication to work, you'll need to be able to have connectivity to your domain controller. So it seems all obvious, but actually very often you'll have on a corporate network, access to domain controller is easy, whereas on remote users typically don't have that connectivity to domain controller, and that connectivity is very much required in order to register and enroll computers. Now you can then, for users when they travel or they may occasionally work from home, they can work with cached credentials just like you normally can, but it is it's a challenge, it's a requirement that you need to keep in mind, that you need to have connectivity to those systems in order for this to work properly. So why would you want to do hybrid join? Because there's a fair bit more work to do. It's a little bit more complex, but the key reasons that we see people want to do this is because they want to have the Active Directory capability. They want to be able to manage with SCCM. Now, if you have Intune as well, SCCM and Intune can work together. Those customers may want to use group policy, for example. You may want to use login scripts and drive mappings. And also, and this really the main reason why we actually have this as an option, it is a good transition in the middle of the road type of solution while you're moving towards a fully cloud native environment, which typically takes quite a bit of work in planning as well when you're looking at that kind of stuff. So we see this more as an interim solution. That being said, this is widely deployed. This is quite a popular setup. So I understand why companies want to do it. Now, at the same time, particular reasons why you may not want to do this is, well, if you have a lot of people working from home, and after COVID, this is a lot more common nowadays. When people work from home, and like, for example, me, I work from home 100% of the time. If I would have to rebuild my machine, for example, if I was in a hybrid join scenario, I would actually have to take the computer into the office, and I would have to actually plan an office visit for that. So if you want to work in a situation where you don't have that dependency of domain controllers, you don't have that dependency on visibility of the domain controllers, and also you want to keep things simpler, then an Entra join is probably an easier solution. But it is more of a transition, it's more of a change, there's more adjustment for users. And when you deal with an Entra join type of environment, you don't really build these standardized images anymore. You try to just configure what configuration you need through tools like Intune, for example. Now, I also mentioned here that Entra join by itself is more secure. That does not mean when you have a hybrid join that you can't get to the same level of security, just there's more configuration you need to do. And one of them that I do need to mention there is what we call laps. And laps you can now run straight out of Entra ID. That is included and is not a licensed feature. Laps is a feature that allows you to reset and scramble the local passwords of your computers. And then if somebody needs to log in with a local admin credential, you can actually get that credential out of the cloud portal. And this way, your computers, each of them has a different local password, which removes a very big attack factor when people break into one computer and they want to do lateral moves. So that's quite important to be aware that you can do that. Now, I want to talk about the environment. I want to talk about what you need to do hybrid join and enable Windows Hello for Business to sign in a hybrid environment. So the first thing you need, and this seems to be obvious, you need Entra ID. So that's the same thing I told last week. But there are a couple of cases here where you may need at least a P1 license. Which is not always the case. So when we spoke about last week and said just doing Windows Hello for Business and Entra ID join has no specific licensing requirements, for most of what we're saying today, that is also true, but there are a couple of cases where it is not, and I will point that out. So keep that in mind. The other thing you need is Active Directory, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be a hybrid environment. So that seems obvious. The next thing, you need to have those two synchronize with each other. So this is fundamental. If you don't have that in place, then you need to put that in place first. Otherwise, things are not going to work. So we want to make sure that your identities, as they are in Entra ID and on-prem Active Directory, are essentially the same as much as possible. Next, this is also really a Windows 10, Windows 11 scenario, so we're not really dealing with the older operating systems. And because what we're talking about here, Windows Hello for Business is what we call a platform login. So we're logging in to a computer environment that nobody's logged in just yet. That scenario really is only supported on Windows machines. So it is not fully supported on Mac OS. It is not supported on iOS and Android, partially because of limitations on those platforms. Now, and this one is not new, but you want to have the same UPN on-prem as in the cloud. Now, that's a requirement that has existed for a very long time whenever you do synchronization and you want to use Office 365 or Microsoft 365, as we now call it. So you want to have the same UPN on-prem and in Entra. So it's the same for this scenario. So it's not really different. Now, I know there are sort of workarounds for this, but really they're quite complex. It's complicated, and if you can make things simple and just use the same UPN in both environments, that works well. And keep in mind, the UPN you have to use has to be of a public domain name. So you can't use a UPN that is company.local, for example, because Entra ID will never be able to resolve that. So it needs to be like what we use in Microsoft, Microsoft.com. Obviously, you'll have to use whatever domain it is you use on your side. Now, let's talk a little bit about the synchronization piece, because there's some important elements that I need to point out and that you need to be aware of. So when we talk about synchronization, we actually have two tools. So the first tool is called Entra Connect Sync. This has had different names in the past. The most recent one was AD Connect. And we've also AD Connect Sync, and I think in the past there was a version was called Dir Sync, etc. So Entra ID Connect Sync is basically the tool, the current version and the current name of the tool that we've had for this for over 10 years, right? And we have a new kid on the block that has been out for a couple of years, which is Entra Cloud Sync. Now they're very, very different, and I do need to clarify a little bit. In most cases, most of you, if you have a hybrid environment in place today, you're most likely going to be using Entra Connect Sync. Now, Entra Connect Sync is based on Microsoft Identity Manager, which is a very big product used in a lot of our largest customers that synchronizes accounts behind all kind of different systems. And so our Connect Sync uses the same synchronization engine and uses the same tools to write the rules for it. So it is not the simplest tool to make customizations to the rules, but it's been there and there's a lot of knowledge out there. So the Connect Sync is purely an active passive type of setup, and it's not even a failover setup. You have one server. That server has a relationship with the Entra ID tenant that you're associated with, and then can synchronize accounts that come from the same Active Directory forest that that server can talk to. So that trust and that connectivity between the domains is quite important. Now, Connect Sync, being very mature, is the one that is used by our largest customers as well. And this is then where that MIM foundation comes in. It can handle very, very large environments. We've seen that we have customers that are synchronizing over several million of accounts through this tool to Active Directory, to Entra ID. So because this one has been out there the longest, it also has the most features. And the last thing you need to remember as well, that this uses a synchronization schedule. So usually changes you make take up to half an hour before they're reflected in Entra ID. That also depends on where that server is located. And if you have replication between your domain controllers, that may slow that down further. Password changes are a lot faster because they're synchronized almost after they've been discovered. Now, the last thing, it also supports, this is the only option you have if you want to use pass-through authentication. Now, I'll quickly touch upon pass-through authentication in one of the next slides. But now I want to talk about Entra Cloud Sync. So Entra Cloud Sync is just an agent. So it's a small agent. This is the future. Cloud Sync uses the provisioning service in Entra ID. So it is actually a cloud-based service that just has an agent. And the benefit of this is that this agent, if you install it in a domain, you can synchronize accounts from that domain. So you could have multiple domains that have no trust with each other and have the accounts synchronize up into central forest. Because you work with an agent, you can deploy multiple agents, and these agents will back each other up and provide high availability. So you have that high availability that is very hard to implement. Well, you can't implement it with Connect Sync, but with Cloud Sync, you can do it. And setting up this agent is a 5-minute job. So it is very quick, and everything is configured in the cloud. It is also self-updating, so you need to patch the operating system. So if you install this on a Windows server, you need to patch that server, but you don't need to do anything else. Right now, we still have a little bit of a limit how large the directory can be that you can synchronize. These limits will eventually be removed, but now you're looking at the upper limit for us of about 10,000 objects, which is probably, since we're talking about small and medium-sized businesses, probably not much of a problem for the people we have here. But, and this is the important thing, all the new functionality we're building is going to go into Cloud Sync. So at some point in the next couple of years, we expect we're going to start moving everybody from Connect Sync into Cloud Sync, because Cloud Sync is easier to live with, easier to manage. It's also a lot faster because it synchronizes based on changes. So it listens for changes in Active Directory, and if there's a change, it synchronizes it. So that is a lot faster than working on a schedule, although sometimes it can confuse people because when there's no changes, nothing seems to be happening. But so Cloud Sync is really the future, and it's also the one that works the best with what we call Cloud Trust. And what is Cloud Trust? You will see that very, very soon. And because Cloud Trust is the option that we really recommend when it comes to hybrid environments, it's good to keep that in mind. Now, obviously, Cloud Trust works with Connect Sync as well. So both, for what we're going to be discussing today, are viable options when it comes to implementing a hybrid environment. So if you have Connect Sync in place today, just make sure you're running a recent version, you keep it up to date, but there's no need to replace it in order to move to a hybrid or to enable Windows Hello for Business. However, if you haven't implemented the synchronization, then I would recommend you start looking at Cloud Sync, because it's going to do everything you need for the scenarios we're discussing today. Now, I mentioned this thing about pass-through authentication. And so when you set up if you set up Connect Sync, especially, you need to choose how you're going to handle passwords. Now, if you do Cloud Sync, you're always going to be using password hash synchronization. But if you have Cloud Sync, you have the choice between pass-through authentication or password hash synchronization. And the thing to remember here is just very simple. Password hash synchronization is where we create a hash for every user's password hash in Entra ID. So we don't actually synchronize the hash. We take the hash as it is stored in on-prem Active Directory, not the password, because we can't read the password. We take the hash and we rehash it with a salted SHA-256 hash and rehash it 1,000 times. Why 1,000 times? It basically makes it too expensive to brute force. And so the hashes, as we store them in Entra ID, are more secure than the ones in on-prem, because they're a lot harder to crack. The on-prem ones actually relatively easy to brute force because the algorithm being used is quite old and we can't change it for backward compatibility reasons. Now, some companies did not like the idea of having these hashes synchronized, so they wanted an alternative solution. And that's where pass-through authentication comes in. Pass-through authentication works with an agent. Here's another agent. We have lots of different agents for different purposes, but this is one of them. And again, they're easy to install and easy to maintain. But what happens then if somebody signs in with a username and password, it actually goes through that agent that checks it against the domain controller and you sign in. The user experience is the same, but when you have the pass-through authentication agent, you can have certain policies that you have on-prem, such as login times, for example. You can have them enforced that way. Now, password hash synchronization actually has the benefit if you use that one, and that's why I would say more than 80% or close to 90% of our customers are using password hash synchronization. Why? Because it's so easy. You just need to tick a box and it's turned on. And if your connectivity to your on-prem network is broken, people can still log in and still use everything that is based in the cloud. Whereas with pass-through authentication, you actually create a dependency on on-prem resources. Now, this is a very long explanation, and then you're going to ask me, what is the actual dependency when we talk about passwordless in this context? Does it make a difference? And actually, it makes no difference for a very, very simple reason. We talk about passwordless, so we talk about signing in without a password. So when you sign in with Windows Hello for Business, you're signing in without ever having a password check done. So the pass-through agent doesn't come into the picture, and the hashes that have been synchronized don't come into the picture, because we're authenticating in a passwordless fashion. So here is the thing: when it comes to synchronization, you can use both Connect Sync and you can use Cloud Sync. You can use both pass-through authentication, you use both password hash sync. The key thing is you need to have the synchronization set up. Now we're going to go to probably the most technically complex part of the presentation. Because as I mentioned before, I mentioned already, dropped a hint called Cloud Sync, Cloud Trust. We have 3 different options on how you configure your environment to use Windows Hello for Business. And one is the oldest one. We have a newer one, and we have one much newer. And they go in order from the most difficult first to actually one that is really quite simple to implement. But there's a reason for all this stuff. So the oldest method we have is what we call certificate trust. So I mentioned before that initially when we have a Windows machine joined to Entra ID and joined to on-prem Active Directory, when you were to log in, you'd be logging with a username and password. Why is that? Well, the computer doesn't know what else is going to work, so it defaults to what always works, right? The other thing is we need to actually set up the environment that you can work in a passwordless fashion for for your on-prem Active Directory. So we know that Entra ID can handle passwordless just fine, and it will do this always the same way. So last week I explained the public and private key thing. So this is the same method that is going to be used here. But how do we authenticate against an on-prem domain controller when we don't have a password? Well, the oldest method we've had available for that is actually certificates. So certificate-based authentication can be used, but there's some consequences when you want to use certificate-based authentication. And this is going to also explain why this is probably not going to be your preferred option. I mean, this solution has been out for several years. This is the oldest solution. And this is also, I mean, I've been saying a couple of times now that you should run your domain controllers in Windows 2016. This is the option you can use if you do not have your domain controllers running on 2016. So this one will work with 2012 R2, so we'll work that far back. Now 2012 R2 is not mainline supported anymore. If you're running those domain controllers, I think upgrading those to more modern operating systems should be a higher priority. But if you want to know how this works and how we can actually use certificates, well, if you want to use certificates, you need a PKI environment. And a PKI environment basically consists of a root certificate authority, and because everything this box issues is effectively keys for people to log in, you want to make this a two-tier PKI infrastructure and then add an HSM to it. Now, an HSM is a piece of hardware. It goes into a rack in the data center, and it will store the key of your root CA. So it's very important that you protect that key, because that key ultimately plays a part into your whole PKI infrastructure. If somebody steals that key, they can give them a login as any user in your environment. So that key, the protection of that key is very, very important, which is why you need an HSM. The problem is there will be a certificate issued to your domain controllers, and in order for your clients to validate the certificate, they need to be able to access what we call the certificate revocation list, which needs to be in a web-based address. So here, that's a certificate issued to the domain controllers. So we need, in order to be able to confirm the validity of that certificate, you need to be able to reach a web-based certificate revocation point. Certificate revocation list distribution point, abbreviated to CDP. This runs on a web server, is not authenticated. And again, you need to have that highly available, because if it's not available, people can't log in. But that's just the PKI bit. And anybody who's ever worked with PKI knows that PKI is quite complex. I mean, I spent years deploying these systems. I know them quite well, but it is not just the complexity of deploying this, it is the complexity of managing it. Because as I mentioned before, you make a mistake here, you expose your whole network. But we're not done with this stuff yet, because all computers need to be able to request a certificate when they're signing in, and that requires ADFS to be in place. And ADFS, we need to have that highly available as well, because your ADFS here is going to be the certificate registration agent. So your computer is going to connect to ADFS to get a certificate from the PKI. So ADFS needs to be available. ADFS needs to have certain pieces publicly available and certain pieces not publicly available. And then based on that, a certificate can be issued to your client. And then on top of that, you need to have something called device write back, which is a feature that requires a PEEP1 license in your Entra ID. So all that kind of stuff, you want to do this stuff, you're very brave, it works great, don't get me wrong, it works great, but this is complex, this is difficult, this requires discipline to manage, and this is something we see primarily in large enterprises that have the people and the know-how to do this. So my recommendation is like, stay away from this. It is not worth the trouble, because we have much better solutions. Let's go to the second one. Now, this one is a variant of the previous one. We felt that, okay, well, having to issue certificates just to do the authentication, we already know how to do public-private key authentication with Entra ID. Can we not do that against a domain controller? So that was the idea, and so we established what we call key trust. Key trust works a little bit, it's a bit different from the previous one, but it has a lot less requirements, but you still have the whole PKI thing you need, because we're issuing a certificate to your domain controllers. And so in order to trust that domain controller, again, you need to have all these PKI pieces in place. So you have that whole PKI set up for a certificate that just goes to your domain controller. But it makes things easier. Your client gets a key rather than a whole certificate. That key, as I explained before, so this is again a public-private key pair. that public-private key pair is generated by the client. The client will submit that key to Active Directory, and then Active Directory is going to synchronize that key to on-prem. So the thing to keep in mind here, as well as once you've actually signed up and you've joined your computers, it can take 30 minutes before it actually works to connect to your on-prem domain controllers. Just keep in mind that it takes a little while. It is less stuff to set up compared to the previous one, but you still have the PKI requirement, which is still quite a lot of work. So I, again, would not recommend this one because we have a solution which is much easier. So all this kind of discussion you have, oh, you want to do this kind of stuff, can't we make it really simple? And CloudTrust is the really simple solution, and it works really neat. It's really clever the way it works. And to set this one up, before I talked about PKI, I talked about ADFS, that kind of stuff. Here in this solution, you'll be running a PowerShell command. And that's all you need to do. So where option 1 could take you weeks and months to set up, option 2, similarly, several weeks, this one takes minutes. But it works very different. So rather than actually here, before we select, first I will use certificate-based authentication. That's supported on multiple versions. And then so I will do key authentication against Active Directory, which requires a Windows 2016 server. This one, by the way, also requires 2016 and above. But rather than use keys or certificates, actually, we're going to use Kerberos. And Kerberos is what it uses when you have a normal client, when it communicates, when it authenticates against Active Directory, it always uses Kerberos. That's the standard method that's used when you do username and password. So how do we get around this password problem? Well, we've built something new. And in a sense, the way this works is technically probably, it's not as simple as you may think, but it's also not as complex. So the first thing we did, we built something new in Active Directory called Entra ID Kerberos. So we've actually built an interface on Entra ID that speaks Kerberos. Okay, great. Now your client is not talking directly Kerberos to these things, because if you know anything about Kerberos, it uses its own ports and it has its own complex configurations, etc. So it's not the simplest thing in the world, but we have Entra ID Kerberos as an endpoint. So now it actually allows us to have Entra ID to participate and be part in your Kerberos, your on-prem Kerberos infrastructure. This is where it gets interesting. So we basically register or Entra ID as a Kerberos read-only domain controller in Active Directory. And you will see it show up. You go in Active Directory. If you run the PowerShell command, and you'll see in the demo later on as well, you will see an object that is created that represents Entra ID in your on-prem Active Directory. And so how does this sign you in? Well, when a user signs into Entra ID, then this Entra ID Kerberos will issue what we call a partial TGT. And now we're getting very technical. I'm going to spare you the details, but a TGT is a ticket granting ticket. And what that means is this is kind of normally in Kerberos, when you sign in, you get a ticket. You get a Kerberos ticket. Now, a ticket granting ticket is a little bit more like one of these coupons you get that's a good for one hamburger, right? So it's something you can use once and you get something in exchange. What we're going to get in exchange for this partial TGT is actually, so this goes to the client and the client sends it to domain controller. And the domain controller, because it recognizes where it came from, it recognizes who signed it, Entra ID, etc., it can replace this with a Kerberos ticket that goes to the client and the client is logged in. So now, the client is communicating with the domain controllers in a normal Kerberos fashion, and you have your single sign-on, you have your Windows Hello for Business sign-in, so it's all passwordless, and the only thing you had to do was run this one PowerShell command. Now, we're going to talk about, very briefly before we switch to the demo, now what's involved in actually turning these things on. So the first thing that I want to show you is how you turn on this CloudTrust. So this is actually surprisingly simple. You need to load a particular module called the Azure AD Hybrid Authentication Management PowerShell module. And yes, you install that with install module Azure AD Hybrid Authentication Management. And when you have that, then you're going to run a particular command. And you can see actually the command is the last one in the line here. You have this, if you look at the line 2 and 3, get credential. This is basically getting the login to your Entra ID, and you get the login to your local domain. If you run this on a computer or an environment where you're already logged in with a credential, for example, domain admin, then you can leave that bit out as well. And this is a link there with the actual resources. So you can go, this is documented, and actually this process is the same as what you would use if you want to enable support for the FIDO2 security keys or the passkey, the device-based passkeys. Now the other bit, and so here you see what happens is you can see there's a little object being created in your domain controller section that basically is called Azure AD Kerberos, and that represents your Entra ID. Now the second bit we have to do is, now it's good we've enabled our environment to accept authentication using Windows Hello for Business. Now we just need to tell our PCs to use it. So there's not too many steps involved, but you do need to do all of them. And so to configure our PCs, we have, again, two options. And these options we've mentioned that before as well, because it's the same. First of all, if you use Intune, so you can either use Intune or you can use group policy, but you shouldn't use both. So in Intune, you would create a settings catalog, and I've put in a screenshot, but I can show it to you in the portal as well later on if you want. But effectively, the three settings you see here on the screenshot are the three settings you absolutely must have. You can see the second one says use Cloud Trust for on-prem authentication. That's important. If you do not specify that, it will actually try to do the key or the certificate trust. And if you don't have that set up because we're using Cloud Trust, as you really should, it's so much easier. You do need to make sure that you tell your PCs that is what they have to use. Right now, if you check on that, actually that category, you'll see there's about another 30 settings. There's quite a lot of them that you want to use to make it more secure. You want to enforce the use of a TPM, etc. But these things, these three are the minimum you must have. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out. You either use Intune or you use group policy. Don't use both. It is not that one is better than the other. It's just if you have both of them, then you get conflicts because there's an order in which they are processed and loaded, and one can then override the other, and things can get very confusing. And trying to troubleshoot that basically gives you gray hair. The other thing is you want to make sure that when you don't create any conflicts with other policies. So when you're working in Intune, you could have a whole bunch of different objects and policies, etc. Make sure you're consistent and you don't configure this in 5 different places and then not have the same settings, for example. So be disciplined about this. And then the last one as well, so like this defaults when you use Intune, and actually same with group defaults to use key trust or certificate trust. So you have to make sure that that second option there, use Cloud Trust for on-prem authentication, is the option you've selected. Because if you don't have that in there, you don't have it enabled, it is not going to work. Now, similarly, if you want to use group policy, you need to have the Passport ADMX and the Passport ADML files. Now, if you're familiar with configuring group policy, and this is not a seminar about group policy, you should know how to use these files. Now, where do you get these from? Actually, they come with Windows 10 and Windows 11. You can find them in your Windows folder. You'll find all the templates that are appropriate for that operating system. Because the settings you need are not going to be included with the template files as they come with your Windows Server 2019, for example, does not include those settings in the files. You'll need to get them from your Windows 10 or Windows 11. So you can find them in the normal location where they would be stored on those operating systems. And then you'll get all the options. And these are the options. And again, they're exactly the 3 options we had before. I've put the address there where you can see it is under administrative templates, Windows Components, Windows Hello for Business. It's pretty easy to find. And you'll see there's also a whole range of other options, several we strongly recommend you enable. Now, before we go to the demo, I just want to lastly point out our team, and I have 3 people from the team here on the call as well. We're a team, we're part of engineering, and engineering is a part of the business in Microsoft that makes products. What we do, a big part of what we do, is actually talk to customers and get customers to tell us everything that is good and bad about our products. And then we tell that to the people building the products so that they adjust and prioritize what our customers want. And the only way we find out what our customers want is by talking to you guys. So if you're interested in talking to us and giving us a piece of your mind about our products, and in our case, this is security products. We don't deal with Office and we don't deal with SharePoint and those things. If you want to give us a piece of your mind and actually contribute and have influence in the decisions and what we design and what we build, then scan that QR code and sign up, and we'll get back to you in the next couple of weeks to set up a session. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jay, who's going to give you a demo of what this all looks like in an actual environment. Over to you, Jay.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Ward. Hi, guys. Thanks a lot for joining this session. Let me just quickly share my screen. I'm just trying to confirm, like, do you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, brilliant. Cool. So guys, like Ward has actually taken us through like the different ways you can actually set up passwordless for on-premises in your environment, especially if you have a hybrid environment. So what we are going to look at today is, like, how do you go about enabling Cloud Kerberos Trust within your hybrid environment. As Ward said, like, this is one of the most easiest ways of actually doing it, and we have a very comprehensive documentation regarding how you can do this. Like, I've already got it set up in my environment, but what I wanted to do is take you through the different steps within the document, make sure that you guys are accustomed to the documentation, plus, like, what it looks like on the actual environment as well, as you go about doing your configuration. So when we do the Cloud Kerberos Trust deployment, like, this is the guide that that Ward had the link to, so you can actually quite easily use this guide to help you do this in your environment as well. The first thing, like, if you go through the documentation, there's the requirements, the deployment steps, but this is the important bit, which is like deploy Microsoft Entra Kerberos. And what it talks about is, like, if you have not done SSO for passwordless up till now in your environment, you need to actually go ahead and do this before you come and configure Windows Hello for Business policy settings within your environment. The option that you have over here is, like, okay, if you have already done it, go ahead and configure Windows Hello for Business. If you have not done it, please go ahead and do the passwordless configuration. So for this, like, the process is well documented as well. But for this one, like, you have to have certain prerequisites. And the prerequisites that I'm going to talk about today is very important. Like, if you don't get it done properly in your environment, you might not be able to get this working easily. The first one is to be able to enable a passwordless security key sign-in to Windows 10 devices. This process is documented quite well as well. So if I go over here, it talks about, like, how you can do this in your Entra environment. If I go to my tenant, like, under protection on your entra.microsoft.com portal, under protection, you'll find authentication methods. And in the authentication methods, you'll find FIDO2 security key, right? So you can go over here and actually enable it for all your users if you want to. In my case, I actually wanted to enable it for a select group of people. So I've just enabled it for a particular group called Passwordless FIDO2, like creativity with the naming over here. But so this is what I have enabled it for. And what you can also do is you can configure some other settings for FIDO2 security sign-in or security key sign-in as well. So in my case, like, I've said, allow self-service setup. I have not enforced attestation. You can enforce it if you wanted to. You can also enforce key restrictions as well. So you can, like, define or restrict keys from a particular manufacturer or with, like, particular IAE GUIDs as well. So you can do those kind of things and make it more secure if that was one of the requirements within your environment. So that was the first thing that was part of the prerequisites for this. The second part is obviously you need to have, or you need to be running, like, at least Windows Server 2016 or later, and have the latest patches installed on your environment. So this is key. Like, you have to have at least Windows Server 2016 domain controllers, and you have to have the latest patches. The next part actually talks about this particular encryption algorithm, and that needs to be enabled on your domain controller. If that is not enabled, it still poses another issue for you. Kerberos needs to be able to use this particular algorithm, and if you have not enabled it, Kerberos will not use it. So if I jump into my domain controller, right, I have got this particular environment set up in my lab, and what I have done is I have actually applied certain policies. So this is an additional DC policy that I have applied in my environment, where I have configured the setting for that particular Kerberos encryption, right? So what I have done is obviously this is all documented, so you don't have to memorize all of these settings and then where to go and find it. But just for information purposes, it's under computer configuration, Windows settings, security options, and the actual setting it's called network security configure encryption types allowed for Kerberos, right? And if you go over here, you get a list of different encryption algorithms that you can allow. And in my case, I've just gone ahead and checked the box. There's a good explanation regarding what this setting is all about and what it does for you in your environment. So that's the group policy that I have configured in my environment, and I've actually applied it to the domain controllers IO. Now, after this, you obviously have to have the credentials, and these credentials come in handy when we do go ahead and configure the or run the PowerShell commands that go with this. So that is very important. This is also something very important if you are using a custom setup or custom configuration for your Entra Connect. So if you are, say, for example, using Entra Connect to sync users from on-premises to cloud, and if you have a custom configuration, that means you're not using the out-of-the-box configuration that came with the setup, just make sure that you are actually syncing the on-premises SIM account name, on-premises domain name, and on the on-premises security identifier as well. So these are the three key attributes. If you have done an out-of-box configuration, you don't have to worry about it. It's part of the default configuration. But if you have done a custom configuration, please go ahead and check and make sure that this is actually synced. In terms of supported scenarios, this is there. You can actually have a look at it. Unsupported is where it is important to understand what is going on. So the unsupported scenario, if the devices are not hybrid hybrid Azure ID joined or Entra ID joined, it's not going to work. Right? It's not going to work for RDP for these scenarios over here. These are some of the other scenarios where it's not going to work as well. So just be mindful of this before you go ahead and set it up in your organization, because if you have particular use cases which require this, you might actually come into some issues. But this is where the fun part begins. So this is the Azure ID hybrid authentication management module and the commands that we need to run. So if you have not installed the module, you can actually quite easily install the module using this particular the install module commandlet and with the name of this particular module, right? Once you have installed it, we actually provide you guidance regarding how to go ahead and create a Kerberos server object within your environment. So we provide you 2 or 3 different examples of how you can do it based on different combinations of what kind of environment or where you are running these PowerShell commands from. But the key command over here is this over here, set Azure ID, Kerberos server. You provide the domain name, the cloud credential, which is your Entra ID credential, and your domain credential if you are running it from some box which does not actually become or does not is not part of the ID domain. So once you run this, what happens is you'll get an object, and if I minimize this screen, you'll see a new object under domain controllers. And this is the object that Ward was mentioning before when he was talking about it with the slide deck. This object gets created. It's called the Azure ID Kerberos object. The object type is obviously read-only domain controller, and this is essential for the second part, that is the enabling of Windows Hello for Business with Cloud Trust. So once you run the command, this actually happens, and you get to see what is going on. Now, to make sure that everything is working properly in your environment as well, you can go ahead and verify the Microsoft Entra Kerberos server settings as well. So this is a commandlet that you can actually use to verify that everything is configured properly, right? And if I go back to my domain controller, I have got this PowerShell script already created, so I can actually use this instead of me typing the commands manually. And if I go to PowerShell, let me just paste this. It's going to ask me for my credential. So I'm going to enter my credential over here, which is my domain credential, lab2 on-premises. Just give me a sec. So this is my on-premises account. And of course, it's going to ask me for my credentials for the cloud as well. So this is the new screen that pops up. I actually used this before, so I'm hoping it will actually remember that. And I think it does. And what it does is, like, it actually will spit out what is going on with the cloud Kerberos server. So okay, so in my case, it is configured. I can see the ID, the user account, the computer account name, the display name, and so on and so forth. You get all this information, which actually suggests that, okay, the configuration that you have done, or the command that you have run with the set Azure ID Kerberos server is actually working for your environment. Now, this is key. You have to make sure that this actually happens properly in your environment. What those bits of information that it actually spits out mean is also documented quite well. So you can actually go over here and look at this and make sure that you are getting all the correct information back. So once you have done this, we can go back to the Windows Hello for Business configuration and continue with the rest of the configuration. So we have done this part over here. We have done we have done this part. Yeah, so we have done the part on the top. Now this is the key part over here. So as Wood was mentioning before, you have got two options to actually configure this in your environment. The first one is Intune. So you can actually utilize Intune and configure this through Intune as well. In my case, what I've done is I've actually configured it with group policy, right? So what I've done is I've created a group policy. I've attached or linked that group policy to a particular OU. In your case, if you wanted to, you can actually link it to the top of the domain and then scope it to a particular group of users or a particular group of computers to make sure that only those get this particular group policy it's not everybody is getting that policy from Diego because you want to test it and then increase the scope afterwards. You can apply the policy both to the computer configuration or to the user configuration and it will both work similarly. Obviously with computer configuration, it applies to the computers and the users log into the computer, they get the policy. For user configuration, the user wherever the user logs in, the policy configuration is applied. So if I go back to my domain controller, this is the policy that we are talking about. So similarly to before, it's all documented. So you'll find the policy under computer configuration, administrative templates, Windows components, and then Windows Hello for Business. And then these are the policy settings that I've enabled based on the documentation. It's exactly, I followed the documentation to the T just so that I can demonstrate that the documentation is also 100% accurate as well. So use a hardware security key device, Windows Hello for Business, and use Cloud Trust for on-premises authentication as well. In some cases, people don't want it to actually be forced on users. So you can go over here and you can say, do not start the Windows Hello provisioning after sign-in. So what will happen in this particular case, it will actually not automatically start when the user signs into the device. So that's the configuration part of things. We have configured everything. Now let's go to the device. With the device, what we have to be mindful of is, first of all, the device has to be a hybrid Azure ID join. So you have to have a hybrid device. It will not work for not only domain join devices. Secondly, the user has to have multi-factor authentication configured as well. So in my case, I've got a device over here that I have already configured with a user, and I've configured the PIN. So let me just log in and show you how this looks like. So voila, nothing out of the ordinary. The device was already set up, so I have been able to log in with an account that was already configured. Now, how does it look like, especially for a new account? So let me just try and sign out of this one over here, and let's use another user, right? So in this case, this is a new user. The user has never logged into the environment, not even to this domain before. So I'm going to use this particular user, and we'll see if the Windows Hello for Business configuration will actually launch for this particular user. So as I said, like this is a new user, it will go through the setup of the profile, and if everything is going well, then it will actually prompt me to set up a Windows Hello for Business as well. We'll give it a sec to actually come up with things. While it's doing this, what I wanted to quickly show as well, because it's taking a bit of time, it says it's almost there, so I'm just going to give it another sec. Okay, there you go. Okay, so that's good. So now it's actually asking me to set up Windows Hello, right? So I can go ahead and say, okay, like good. It will do some thinking and like ask me to do multi-factor authentication for that user. As I said before, multi-factor authentication is essential, so make sure you actually have this already already in your environment. So this is like, it's now prompting me for a number match. This was something that was introduced, I think last year sometime. You should already be aware of this. So I'm just going to do multi-factor authentication on my phone. So that has gone through. That's good. And now it's asking me to set up a PIN. So let me just enter a PIN, confirm the PIN. And I'm all set. So now I can actually use that PIN to log into this device. Now this is great, especially for for people in terms of user experience as well, the use of the ease of access to devices. And if you have shared devices in your environment as well, this works incredibly well. Users don't have to remember passwords and those kind of things. They can quite easily come in, enter a PIN, quickly access the device, do whatever they need to do, and then the next user can actually jump in and do their work as well. So that's how easy it is to actually go ahead and do this. Let me just quickly sign out as this user, and we'll try to see if the PIN works. So this, and there you go. So that's the user. Let me enter the PIN, and voila, the PIN works as well. So this is all good. I had the device already configured, everything was working properly, and it works properly, right? So I don't have any problems with this. But what if we ran into some issues, right? So you configured everything, but the thing, this is not working properly. So I have another device that I have in a error state. So this is a device that I have created. I'm logged in as a user over here. If I go over here, I'm logged in as sales user 1. But in this case, I can't actually the device did not prompt me to actually set up a Windows Hello for Business. And there is a reason for this. So if you want to look at or troubleshoot what is going on, you can use this this particular command, dsregcmd. Basically, it's a directory services registration command that you can use to see what is going on with your device. And I've done just the status. So it's status. And what I'm seeing at the very bottom over here is the next generation connectivity prerequisite check, right? So this is where I get to see, okay, has the policy been enabled, right? In this case, it's saying no. Is the device eligible? No. Session is not remote. No, right? So, and because of that, it says okay, the prerequisite result is it will not provision. It will not provision Windows Hello for Business. So this gives me some information regarding what is going on and what is the what could be the reason behind why Windows Hello for Business is not working in this particular case. I know the policy is not enabled because this particular device object is not in the correct IU, so it's not getting the policy settings. But what about the other bits? What do they mean, right? So if I go back over here and if I go to the troubleshooting tab, right? So this is where you can see what is going on. So it says, okay, device is not eligible. So what does it mean, right? So the NGC prerequisite check, device is not eligible, basically means that the device hardware requirement for enrolling into Windows Hello for Business is not sufficed, or it's not actually sufficing that particular requirement. So that could be the reason why this is not working. So in terms of troubleshooting, you can quite easily utilize the dsregcmd status commandlet, and it will actually give you the prerequisite check for NGC, which is the next generation connectivity, next generation credentials, and you can actually look at this and then identify what is going on to troubleshoot and then be able to hopefully fix the problem as well. So I think I have covered everything in detail. What did you want to make any comments?
Oh, this was very interesting. Thank you for that. There's some questions around the management of Intune. That's been going on in chat as well. And so you showed there's a group policy setting where you can temporarily disable this. And obviously in Intune, you would do that slightly different because that one particular setting doesn't show up in there. But you could even possibly deploy that as a GPO through Intune. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But one of the things to keep in mind is most of what you deal with these things here is when you enable this stuff, indeed, it will trigger a user to start enrolling for Windows Hello for Business. And typically you want to start deploying these things to users that have been notified that it's going to happen. Now, it isn't mandatory for users to do some of that stuff. So users can kind of cancel out of that and not actually enroll, which is actually more the question I've had in the past from customers. So like, how can we force users to do this? If you know where to click, you can kind of just skip out of that dialogue. But this particular option, do not start Windows Hello provisioning after sign-in, doesn't exist in the same form in Intune right now.
Yes, yeah, and that's an interesting point. So, like, in some cases, like, customers might not want the users to be, like, prompted straight away to set up Windows Hello for Business. So you can actually, check this box, keep it like configured and sitting in there. And as Ward said, like, once you have done the communication, you can then uncheck that box and it'll start kicking in, and that should work. According to the documentation, you can have configuration both in Intune and in group policy. As Ward suggested before, don't try to do it in both. But if you accidentally do it in both, I think group policy actually takes precedence. So just look at the documentation before you do this. But the advice that we have is please try not to overcomplicate it. Try to keep it as simple as possible and get it going. Give it a go. And as I said before, you can scope these policies to a certain group of people. Try it with them. If it works properly for you, then you can expand the scope and cater for the rest of the users in your environment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so avoid clashes, right? There's a very interesting question that also ended up in chat that I do want to address as well. So like, what's the impact of having a password expiration date? For example, 45 days and you need to change your password. What's going to happen when you use passwordless? Well, here's the interesting thing. Password expiration is checked when you use a password. So if you log in without a password, then there's no password expiration. So say, for example, if your network password has actually expired, you will still be able to sign in a passwordless fashion because that check is never performed. So that's an important thing to keep in the back of your mind, because you're not using a password, that policy doesn't take effect. But then the moment you start using that password, then that password is going to be expired and you're going to have to address that whichever way that is addressed. Typically, then people have to pick a new password if it's a local login, for example. But if you just do passwordless, you can keep on using that without the password being renewed, which is kind of logical because you're not using the password in the first place. It's one of the reasons nowadays, even in Microsoft, where we're all using passwordless pretty much all the time, we don't have a password expiration anymore. For a fairly long time, we had it set to 1 year, and now there's no expiration anymore. So we don't force people to change a password they're not using. I hope that answered the question. I see somebody's still typing away for another question, so let's. I think it's a long question that's being typed. In a hybrid scenario, would this mean connecting back? Okay. So in a hybrid scenario, if you have a hybrid environment, one of the things to be aware of when you do a password change, right? You can change your passwords in two ways when your computer is hybrid joined. If you need to change your password, if you do the traditional Control-Alt-Delete and you change your password, then that password is changed locally in the domain controllers. That change has to synchronize between the domain controllers and then get synchronized by connect sync back into Entra ID. So Entra ID will find out this change in password probably in a couple of minutes. So there's a delay there, right? Now, in the other direction, if you go into the Azure portal or the Entra portal and you change your password from there, you're actually writing it directly to on-prem and then changing it there. But at that time, we can change it at the same time in Entra because we capture that at that time. So that doesn't affect what happens when your password expires. Now, okay, hold on. There's okay. What's the effect of password renewal on this Kerberos thing? Again, there's a lot that we actually didn't dig into detail, but when you sign in Entra ID, when you log in, there's a lot of things that are sent to your computer, and one of them is a primary refresh token, and it is a session key that is used to renew these things automatically in the background. So should your Kerberos token expire, then your client, your Windows machine, is capable of renewing this automatically, completely transparently in the background. So you won't see that happen. So you should not actually notice any of these things when they come through. So you have ultimately the passwordless is purely the authentication part. And while this is part of a kind of a different seminar I ran a couple of weeks ago, you have the authentication. So the authentication is just what happens in the beginning. And so passwordless is authentication. The authorization, checking what you have access, is something that is done all the time, over and over again, more than 100 times a day for the average user. And so all these things at that point when things need to be renewed, etc., that is all handled in the background for you, and you won't notice that. Good. The session is being recorded. We'll probably upload it onto YouTube and share with everybody. If there's no more other questions, we're going to wrap up and stop the recording.